When he was arrested for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, Socrates was asked why he chose to stay in the city, knowing full well that if he stayed and was found guilty, he would be sentenced to death. Supposedly, Socrates replied with the now famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Soon afterwards, the philosopher drank the poisoned hemlock and passed away in 399 BCE. The legacy of Socrates is long-reaching, especially considering one of his more famous students was Plato, who in turn taught Aristotle, who in turn tutored a young man who would become Alexander the Great. The legacy doesn't stop there, especially when speaking about education, because one of the methods Socrates used in discussing matters of importance has now become known as the Socratic Method. And this method, amongst others, may have led Athens to feel that Socrates was a danger to society. Welcome to the Instructor's Kit Bag, a podcast for all educators from Army Sustainment University at Fort Gregg Adams, Virginia. I am your host, Nate Ball, and we're going to quickly discuss what the Socratic Method is, what it isn't, and how to engage your students in critical thinking while challenging them to examine their beliefs and how they got there. So the first order of business is to discuss what the Socratic Method actually is intended to do. Put simply, the Socratic Method is a dialogue of questioning between the teacher and the students. This usually takes the form of the teacher introducing a topic and having the students give their opinions and support those opinions. During this exercise, the teacher may drive the line of questioning with thought-provoking questions that are meant for students to examine their beliefs and possibly even challenge or change those beliefs. This benefits critical thinking by breaking up complex, difficult, or unknown subjects and allow everyone in the class to examine them. Most of the time, the Socratic Method should be used, not to teach, but to examine. That is to say, there can be as many answers as there are people in the room. The teacher does not give out their specific perspective and may not even have the answers to the questions provided. In this way, the teaching environment is a two-way street of learning, and examining conclusions is in a cohesive spirit. This is known as the classic Socratic Method. The way it is mostly used, in my experience at least, is what's considered by many to be the modern Socratic Method. The modern Socratic Method is getting students to examine complex topics with particular facts and goals to reach. Now, there are a couple of ways to accomplish this, both leading the students to specific ideas. I call these the prod and pepper techniques. In the pepper technique, the teacher may choose a student and ask them a specific question. For example, maybe something about a legal ruling or an ethical dilemma in the medical field. That teacher will then pepper the student with rapid-fire questions, either to trip up the student, maybe to expose contradictions, or expose lack of knowledge. This method can be effective in certain areas of expertise, as it introduces quick thinking, articulated arguments, and the introduction of pressure to questioning. The prod technique is a little gentler. The goal still is to lead the student to a given answer or conclusion, but allowing more leading questions and time for the student to formulate an answer. There may be more correction from the teacher, either by clearing up inconsistencies or incorrect data, and this method works well for those who are unaccustomed to this type of method or questioning. To illustrate what the Socratic Method could look like in class, we could start with a less controversial topic and then lean into a more controversial subject as the students progress. So let's begin with a class setup. Sometimes when I've run the Socratic Method, the modern one, I would pair students up to let them digest the question and give them time to brainstorm. I have also just simply presented the class with a topic and had them do individual brainstorming and then just let the discussion begin. For this scenario, I could ask the question, how do you know when you are right about something? In this discussion, we may come up with several answers, but in order to properly execute the Socratic Method, we may need to understand how each of us defines certain words. In this case, what does the definition of right mean to you? And then once we have accomplished this, how do we define what no means? Now, if we want to up the ante with topics that might be considered more controversial, we could then ask the question, when is it right to go to war? Again, we may need to define the word war. If, as a teacher, I am using the modern Socratic Method, I might either prod or pepper the students with questions to get them to a determined outcome. However, I may choose the classic approach and examine when a student feels it is right to go to war. With all this being said, I'm sure you've already spotted some pros and cons, so let's talk about some of those cons. In an unprepared environment or with an untrained teacher, the Socratic Method could lend itself to mayhem. Now, this could be either because students would talk over each other, including the teacher, or they might be unable to control their emotions, also including the teacher. Another negative could be that only a couple of students feel comfortable discussing anything out loud and in front of their peers, thus leaving a lot of the class behind. And let's not forget, some people need to know the answer. And if you run the Socratic method where there's no definitive answer, you could get some irritation from the students. However, in a prepared environment with a trained instructor, the Socratic method can engage an entire class. It promotes critical thinking skills, allows students to feel safe in challenging other ideas and having their own ideas challenged. And it also increases empathy and emotional intelligence. So what isn't the Socratic method? Well, the Socratic method is not the method to impart content into students. Without any previous knowledge or experience, the Socratic method breaks down and becomes a direct lecture. The Socratic method is also not a case study or something that needs to go through a troubleshooting process. A case study is its own method of instruction. The Socratic method is designed in the classical sense to spark dialogue between students and the teacher with no predetermined outcome to be met. In the modern sense, the Socratic method is used to lead students to a predetermined conclusion, but having them get there through examination of beliefs, principles, and evidence. So whatever your flavor of Socratic method may be, either classical or modern, or prod and pepper, just remember that it can be highly beneficial in class. This could be used to break up a lesson, to pre-assess what the students may have learned before they came to you, or even as a broad stroke check on learning. And if you wanted to read what Socrates wrote about his own method, I think you'd be very sad. Much like his name was lent to the Socratic method, he also lent his name to the Socratic problem. That is to say, the attempt at figuring out what Socrates really thought about anything, seeing as how he never wrote anything down, and if he did, it has now long been lost. All we have left of his life is through his contemporaries. A couple of his students wrote about him, such as Plato, but another of his contemporaries, Aristophanes, was a playwright who did not care for Socrates at all. So much so that the man wrote several plays deriding and making fun of Socrates, as well as other philosophers, for their foolish views of the world. At any rate, whether he wrote down anything or not, we still have the idea of the Socratic method and how we can use it in the classroom. Thank you for listening to the Instructor's Kit Bag, a podcast for all educators from Army Sustainment University of Fort Gregg, Adams, Virginia. I am your host, Nate Ball, and never forget to stop learning and never forget to stop teaching.